Every year you wait to deploy a climate solution, you lose a chance at being effective. So in fact, if you want to cut emissions in half in a decade and keep cutting towards net zero by, let's say, 2050 to 2060, essentially you lose about 7% a year for every year you wait in terms of its ultimate impact on climate change. That's crazy. And that's compounding, by the way, too. 7% a year. You wait 10 years, you lose half the effectiveness. You wait 20 years, you lose 3/4 effectiveness in this kind of framework. So that's why we should act now with the tools we have today, because they can start having impact now and every single year out into the future. That's why we often say at Project Drawdown, now is more important than new, and time is way more important than tech. If you think we don't have the technologies we need to stop climate change, you're wrong. We have them. Drawdown outlines them very carefully. So, don't wait for technology. We got pretty much all that we need to get the job mostly done, if not entirely. Sure, technology will help, but now is better than new. Time is more important than tech. So let's deploy what we have, make it cheaper, faster, better. There's definitely a role for the private sector and venture and tech in this. There's money to be made. There's businesses to build. And I think it's the biggest business opportunity in human history. But stop chasing shiny objects. That's not business, that's ego.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Climate Tech 360, where we connect with diverse voices in the climate sector to make informed choices in supporting the future of climate technologies. I'm your host, Samia, and today we are speaking with Dr. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is a leading nonprofit organization, and its mission is to help the world stop climate change as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible and reach drawdown, the point at which levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere start to decline. If you work in climate, you are likely very familiar with Project Drawdown as well as Dr. Foley. He is a leading climate scientist, sustainability expert, educator, public speaker, advisor to governments, foundations, nonprofits, business leaders. His presentations have been featured in hundreds of venues. He has over 140 scientific articles. There is really no end to his contribution in this field, and he's dedicated his entire career to it. I'm very excited to share this episode because I think when you're working in any industry, not just climate, it's very easy to go deeper and deeper into a subject area to the point where you can sometimes lose perspective of the big picture. And I think that's what Drawdown does. It gives you a systems level, forest from the trees perspective on exactly what we need to focus on to reach this point of drawdown. In this episode, we talk about the time value of carbon and how important it is for impact investors to be factoring this into their decision-making process. We go through the list of emission sources and talk about his favorite technologies in each of these areas. We discuss which areas are underfunded. So if you're an investor, you've seen that chart showing where capital is going versus where actual emission sources are. And there is a definite mismatch. But I asked Dr. Foley whether it makes sense to tie investment dollars with emissions because some sectors might require more capital investment. We talk about food and ag, what Drawdown calls the new frontier in climate, and whether technology is really the solution in this sector. We talk about the low-hanging fruit, or what they call emergency breaks, areas like methane and deforestation, which, if addressed, can have an outsized impact on climate change mitigation. Finally, Dr. Foley gives us a preview on the Drawdown Capital Coalition, a pro bono systems-level science advisory, which has been launched this month for impact investors and philanthropists. We talk a lot about time and how critically important it is to focus on the solutions that can reduce emissions now, in this decade. And now, onto the episode. Dr. John Foley, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think Project Drawdown is such a useful resource for investors. And I go back to it time and time again. And I would love to be able to ask you some questions using an investor lens. So I think I already told you, but I like to do research on all my guests. But with you, there was a lot more material to do research on because you're out there in the public realm. I read all your blogs and I listened to, a bunch of your podcasts.
Oh, you're the one. Okay.
Well, yeah, I've listened to your TED Talk, your Boston TED Talk twice. And I've always had some questions around Project Drawdown and some of the numbers, and I really wanted to come at it with an investor lens. But first, I was hoping that we could talk about a subject that isn't talked about enough in the investor community, and that is the time value of carbon. Could you talk a little bit about that and explain what it is?
Yeah, the time value of carbon is just an idea, kind of like the time value of money, which obviously investors are familiar with. For regular folks, it means things like, hey, if you want to retire when you turn 65 or 70, it's probably helpful to start saving when you're young and accumulate financial impact over time. So when you get to that age, you have a big pile of money that you can then live on. But now for carbon, the same thing is basically true, because what determines the future of our climate isn't this year's emissions or even next year's emissions. It's the accumulation of emissions over many, many years and decades and even centuries. So it isn't just what we do this year or what we do in 2049 or whatever. It's the accumulation of our actions from now until the future, in mid-century even, that really shapes the future of our climate. So that's why we have to start acting on climate now and accumulate impact between now and mid-century and even beyond. Just like you should start saving today for the future, you should start acting today on climate change, building up cumulative impact on the atmosphere.
And so would you say that on that basis, we should really prioritize the things that we can deploy now, that can be commercialized now, versus something that is going to take 15 years to scale?
Well, that's exactly right. So with the time value of carbon lens, what you learn is every year you wait to deploy a climate solution, you lose a chance at being effective. So in fact, if you want to cut emissions in half in a decade and keep cutting towards net zero by, let's say, 2050 to 2060, essentially you lose about 7% a year for every year you wait in terms of its ultimate impact on climate change. That's crazy. And that's compounding, by the way, too. 7% a year. You wait 10 years, you lose half the effectiveness. You wait 20 years, you lose 3/4 effectiveness in this kind of framework. So that's why we should act now with the tools we have today, because they can start having impact now and every single year out into the future. That's why we often say at Project Drawdown, now is more important than new, and time is way more important than tech. And so when you look at a climate solutions portfolio, of course, you want to look at things across many different sectors, all the different places we need to do things. But we also have to look as a portfolio over time and weight the portfolio towards solutions that are deployable and actionable today, not the ones that are going to be waiting 5, 10, 20 years out into the future. So that's why I get a little bit cranky around kind of tech bros, if you will. I hate that term, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Talk about, well, we need deep tech. We need to disrupt this and disrupt that. And usually the solutions we're talking about are 10, 20, 30 years away, if ever, including things like fusion. My first job out of high school and in college was in a fusion laboratory. I'd hate to admit it. It was in the 1980s. And back then, fusion was 20 years away. Well, it's still 20 years away. It's always 20 years away. Same thing with advanced nuclear, small modular reactors. Those were talked about in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. They're still not here. They're still 20 years away. Same thing with carbon capture technologies. They're always sometime in the future. Yeah, and they're often a distraction from doing the work we need today. So not only are they not good as an investment as a climate solution, because you're losing too much time that other solutions could have been working on the atmosphere, they also sometimes distract us from doing the work we need to do today. And that's kind of like why they're doubly bad in some cases.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I was just looking at the IEA's sustainable development scenario. So they tracked the technologies in electricity and renewables in 2018 and how much we want to get to in 2040. And nuclear was at 10% in 2018. And it's ideally, we want it to be 12 in 2040. And so spending hundreds of millions on nuclear when renewables, we need them to go up from 26% to 68%.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make logical sense to me.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm not anti-nuclear. It's just, it's not performing. It's not growing. It's too expensive. These projects get delayed too long and go way, way, way over budget, at least in the West. Maybe China can pull it off. Maybe some other places can, but definitely not in North America and Europe. We just can't build stuff like that anymore. Nuclear is the only form of energy, I think, in human history that got more expensive over time, not less. So it has a negative learning curve. That's not a good horse to bet on.
Yeah.
What I like about different energy technologies in particular is often you see the more modular the technology, the smaller, the more little bite-sized it is, the faster it falls in cost, the steeper its so-called learning curve. The more solar we build, the cheaper it gets. The more batteries we build, the cheaper they get. The more LED lights we build, the cheaper they get. And so these technologies are kind of like the iPhone. They get cheaper, faster, better all the time because they're little bite-sized things we can mass produce in huge factories in places like China and elsewhere. And then we can ship them around the world and rapidly assemble them. That's great. They're kind of following the Moore's law style of growth. But big, clunky billion-dollar projects like carbon capture facilities, nuclear power plants, fusion laboratories, they are like one-off kind of solutions. You build one multi-billion-dollar thingamabob, and it gets expensive, it gets delayed, and there's no chance for learning, at least not much. And so those technologies seem to be stagnating and not growing very well. So I think there's a lesson from kind of consumer electronics. Small, modular, replicable solutions can scale wildly fast, and solar is getting cheaper faster than even the most optimistic scenarios ever said, and more ubiquitous. Same with batteries, same with LED lighting, same soon, I think, with heat pumps and EVs. These things are going to be mass produced and get better and cheaper all the time. Those are the technologies that are going to make the difference. Big, clunky engineering projects that cost billions of dollars at a time with lots of corruption, lots of delays, lots of government bureaucracies involved tend to really disappoint us. And that's going to be, bioenergy projects in the US, especially. Biofuels never really came around after corn ethanol. That never happened. Carbon capture, hydrogen, all the, various rainbow flavors of hydrogen. We've been hearing about that for decades. Fusion, small modular nuclear. I've waited 30 years hearing about all those technologies, and none of them are actual real, meaningful solutions today. But solar is kicking their ass. That's interesting.
Yeah. There's this great series of charts that you have in Project Drawdown that I've always wanted to ask you about. And in fact, this is a kind of a recurring discussion in the venture community. Like, are we allocating dollars to the right things? And actually, if you think about it from an impact perspective, if you're an impact first fund, you have a moral responsibility to allocate capital to the right things. And I think that incorporating time value of carbon into your investment process is absolutely essential. But just going back to the chart, so you have this portfolio of cost-effective solutions, and then you compare it side by side with the actual dollars that are going to the different areas. So you have venture, government, and philanthropy. And there's an obvious mismatch, especially in VC, where most of the money is going into transportation. In government, I think most of the dollars are going into electricity. But I wonder whether it logically makes sense for the dollars to track with the carbon, because there are some technologies like industry, for example, the hard to abate sectors like cement, steel, that will likely require more investment dollars.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me explain a little bit about how we make that comparison. When you use the time value of carbon, it tells you overwhelmingly, at least 95% of the work we need to do is cutting emissions and cutting them really, really fast. Carbon removal in all its forms, biological, oceans, regenerative agriculture, forest, machines, whatever, should be maybe less than 5%. So that's part of the weighting we have to get right. How much is cutting emissions versus removing carbon? I'd say 95 to 5, if not maybe even more, towards cutting emissions. And then within cutting emissions, we can divide up the work into, well, how much of that emissions problem is coming from electricity versus industry versus food and agriculture and land use versus buildings and transportation. And when you do that, I hope people can visualize this. You can imagine kind of a bar chart of, here's the carbon we need to work on. 96% of it is cutting emissions. Within that, it's a bunch of electricity, a bunch of food, industry, transportation, buildings, and other stuff. And so we have kind of a guidepost, if you will, telling us this is the carbon we need to work on between now and the middle of the century. Cutting emissions in these big areas is most of it. Well, we can then compare that to where does the money go in these solutions? And so we've been kind of watching at least what people self-report. And I think that self-reporting isn't always very accurate. But what we get is some data that shows where's the money going, whether it's philanthropy or venture or maybe government funding. And what it shows is a huge disconnect. For example, in 2021, where we had data for 1 year, 67% of all the venture capital, which is about $90 billion that year, way more than governments were spending on climate solutions, $90 billion. 2/3 of that money went into just one solution.
Yeah.
Electric cars and scooters. That is a wild disconnect between where the money's going and where the carbon is needed. That's a 5%, maybe 10% solution at most, but it got 2/3 of the funding. But your question is a good one. Should dollars exactly line up to carbon? Maybe not for any particular one technology, but at the sectoral level, at these big, huge mega sectors like industry, transport, buildings, there are really cheap solutions we should be deploying now, and there are some always very expensive solutions. So I think venture capital has made two mistakes. One is it bets on expensive, shiny, high-tech things quite often, rather than the cheap, practical things we need to do now, but never seem to get done. So I think that's one issue. And sometimes they chase hype. No, duh.
Yes.
If hype were a renewable energy resource, we would have solved the world's problems a long time ago. Yeah. But so I think people were chasing Elon. People were seeing success and saying, I can exit in a few years because this technology, whether it works or not, is cheap now for me to invest in. I can build a company and exit at its peak, whether it's even profitable, whether it even works. And that's one of the problems with venture capital. As much as we need it, it has perverse incentives to follow the lemmings, to follow the hype wave, and not really worry about impact as much as it should. So I would challenge some VCs, like, are you really measuring impact, or are you chasing hype and clear exits? That's just a big question. But I think if you look at the impact, yeah, you could find solutions at $10 a ton. You can find dollars at $20 a ton, $50 a ton in any sector and start investing in them. So I don't think it's a wild disconnect between carbon and money at the macro level. Actually, it should be kind of lined up, at least in the macro picture over time, over the world, over different flavors of capital. But I do think different flavors of capital, whether it's government money or philanthropy or impact first money, should be doing things that are kind of hard and probably don't have a clear profit or clear exit. And, impact then bleeds into venture and private equity. And then, they got to make money either as an exit or in actual returns. That's obvious. So we have a capital stack. I want to align that with the carbon stack of across sectors and across time and across price points. There's a whole variety of things we need to do early, middle, and late that are cheap, medium, and expensive, and across multiple sectors, about 10 of them. There's a whole kind of matrix of things we need to do in carbon, and there's a whole matrix of money and what it tries to do. Let's see if we can line them up a little bit more optimally. Again, align the capital stack to that carbon stack, if you will. And I don't think we're doing that very well. I think we're following hype and fads and politics, not so much where the science is, but I blame science for that. We haven't been talking investor speak. Scientists don't talk about the time value of carbon. They talk about, integrated carbon budget balances or something, which nobody else understands.
Yeah.
So I think we got to start talking to investors more and say, hey, there are some basic science ideas about, time value of carbon, align carbon and capital. And this might help guide investing a little bit better. Time value of carbon is really, really critical. And this is what the tech community's gotten completely wrong.
I'm glad we're talking about it.
You got to emphasize the low-tech, fast things, not the high-tech, slow things.
I was hoping we could do a little fun exercise and go through each of the sectors that you outlined in your direct emissions cut and just talk about 2 or 3 of your sort of favorite technologies or technologies that come to mind.
Yeah.
Can we start with electricity?
Sure. So, electricity, the story here, of course, is renewables like solar, especially, but wind as well, and battery storage are getting cheaper, better, and more ubiquitous faster than anybody thought. We're hitting global tipping points in electricity, and these kind of, solar and wind renewables obviously have a long way to go, but they are cheaper than fossil fuels. They're growing way faster, and faster than any time in history. And I think we're poised at a tipping point for those to really, really accelerate. So that's the really good news. Another area I find really interesting is kind of breakthroughs in geothermal. There's some companies now that are doing, really advanced geothermal that can be that kind of steady energy source that we probably need to backfill some wind and solar and storage now and again. And nuclear is just not going to get there quick enough. But geothermal is cheaper, it's scalable, its permitting is way easier, fewer social and political obstacles, it's insurable. It's safe, can't make it into bombs and stuff like that. I mean, this is a pretty interesting technology. So I'm watching geothermal a lot these days. I think that's pretty interesting. But solar and wind and batteries are going to do the lion's share of this work.
This is the tough one, industry. So say steel, cement. What are some of your favorite technologies?
Steel, cement are big. Also landfills and wastewater treatment, which are not getting the same attention, are even bigger when you combine that. So dealing with waste, especially organic waste going to landfills, what goes to wastewater, that's food waste, it's organic waste. This stuff should never be heading to landfills or into our wastewater. And that emits methane when it decomposes. So we have a big job to do in cleaning up the waste streams of the world, making sure it doesn't become a giant methane factory. So I'm really interested in that. But then after those would come steel and cement, and refrigerants are some of the most important kind of products in the industry sector that are nasty.
Refrigerants, yeah.
And hard to decarbonize. So refrigerants, we have to rethink. We moved away from chlorofluorocarbons because of the ozone layer, but now we use hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, as refrigerants. But those are potent greenhouse gases. So we now to go to maybe a third generation of refrigerants that are not ozone destroying nor climate warming. And that technology exists, but we need to make that transition. And I think it's underway, but it needs to accelerate. Doesn't get talked about enough. Steel and cement, there are solutions there for sure to make low carbon or negative carbon cement. That's really interesting. And also in steel. But, we have some work to do there. I think those are areas that rightly some investing needs to go into in basic research and in, new tech development. Those are areas we need to watch very carefully.
Transportation.
So transportation is about 14% of global emissions. Over 10% of that 14 is from cars and trucks. So electrifying vehicles is going to be a big thing there, of course. EVs, I think, are going to absolutely dominate the future in this space. And that's really exciting to see that take off. But long-haul trucking and other things may require some other solutions along the way, especially getting away from dirty diesel engines. We need to do better with rail, not only more rail, but electrify the rail we have. The US and Canada, for example, has pretty pathetic countrywide train systems, and they emit more per passenger mile than flying would be, because most of them are old, dirty diesel locomotives outside of the northeast quarter of the US, for example. But going from the west coast to east coast of the US, you are better off flying than taking the train from a climate point of view. And that's sad. We need to invest in that and do better. Aviation gets a lot of attention, but it's actually a little less than 2% of global emissions. But it's the 2% that a very small number of people are dominating, mostly rich Europeans and Americans and Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift. Yeah. Cheap private planes.
Bill Gates.
Yeah.
Whatever. Yeah. So cumulatively, it's a small-ish number, but wow, a few of us are really making, really driving that number higher than it should be. So, rethinking flying itself. Do we need to always go on a flight to do business? Nope. We can Zoom and do other things. But also getting aviation to be more efficient, to produce fewer contrails, and also to use maybe sustainable aviation fuels should they actually exist in the future. But right now, they're less than a drop in the bucket of the whole picture. In the near term, is a kind of avoiding aviation is probably a good kind of wedge solution in there. Something I try to do for my own sanity too is do most business over Zoom. And when I do fly for work, make sure I do at least, several things on one trip, not just one. And I think we could all do a little bit of that, especially in the business travel side of things. But I would never want to tell people to don't visit grandma
Go visit
because
your
of the
family.
climate crisis.
Yeah.
But, no, I'm not going to tell you that. But we need to do better in aviation, but it's not as big as most people perceive it to be. But it's still percent here, percent there is actually a pretty sizable impact when you add it up over time.
Buildings.
Buildings, heat pumps. Oh, heat pumps are awesome. So air source heat pumps, of course, they're getting very popular across Europe after the Russia-Ukraine war, making natural gas unreliable and expensive. But heat pumps are miracles. So thermodynamics, they heat, they cool, they're amazingly efficient. They're powered by whatever electricity you've got. And even if you still have gas and coal in your mix, it's still better than burning fossil fuels in your basement to heat your house. So I'm really excited to see that transition as Europe leading the way. But in the United States, states like Maine, where fuel oil is very expensive, are rapidly transitioning to heat pumps for economic reasons, not just climate reasons. And I think as we begin to convince the heating and cooling industry, the people who install these and put them in and spec them out, heat pumps are going to be a big, big win for heating and cooling. And they work really well, but it's going to take a little time to flip over the installed base of all that infrastructure. But the technology is here today and it works great.
And then you have a category for other, but I'm blanking on what was in that.
Others, the stuff that's like, how the energy industry refines and produces oil and gas and things like that. Most of that is kind of refining crude oil into its components, like heating fuel, gasoline, kerosene, jet fuel, things like this. So that takes a lot of energy and there are emissions associated with it. There are also emissions, especially of methane along the way too, that are flaring and fugitive emissions, the kind of a leakage of methane out of abandoned coal mines, abandoned gas wells, pipelines that need to be tightened up. This is, again, probably the number one top priority for climate action right now, immediately, alongside stopping deforestation, is plugging methane leaks. Huge and fast. And cheap. We can see them from satellites now.
Yeah.
So go there
imaging.
And bring a wrench.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's no technology needed besides like a wrench half the time. Leaking pipes, abandoned wells. We need some concrete to fill the old wells and we need some wrenches to plug the leaks. I mean, but yet we haven't done it. That's the thing that's so maddening to me is there's so many low-hanging fruits for climate we haven't picked yet. And people are talking about the fruits at the top of the tree because they're fun and to talk about it.
That's my next question. Let's save the low-hanging fruit question. We could come back to methane. Very quickly, there was a category I left out, which is a huge category, but it's a really important one, food and ag. So what you call the new frontier as it relates to climate change. I listened to your 2023 wrap-up, and you talked about how food and ag is going to be a focus for Project Drawdown in this coming year. So from your blog, food and agriculture and land use accounts for 25% of greenhouse gases, but really a third of global emissions if you include the entire food system, including transportation, packaging, refrigeration, cooking food. But there's also this unusual dynamic in this sector. So quoting directly from George Monbiot's excellent book, Regenesis, 4 countries harvest 76% of maize exported. 5 countries sell 77% of the world's rice. 5 sell 65% of the world's wheat. 3 grow 86% of the world's soybeans. 4 companies control 90% of the world's grain trade. And this just keeps going. There's a very small group of companies that control agriculture, and there's a very small group of countries as well. And so when you look at this dynamic, and then when you look at food and the solutions that you've presented in this area are protect nature, so reduce deforestation, waste less food, shift to healthier diets, so less eating of meat, less beef especially, and then farm better, so more regenerative ag. When you combine these two elements, I wonder whether food and ag is just a sector that will rely less on technology and more on policy and behavioral shifts.
Well, you summarized it very well. You're absolutely right. Climate change problems from food and agriculture are enormous. They're a quarter to a third of the global picture, depending where you draw that boundary. And they tend to be concentrated in a handful of commodities, a handful of countries, and often a handful of big corporate actors. So there are lots of these so-called 80-20 rules in ag emissions.
Wow.
For example, deforestation. The biggest emitter of all in food and ag, and 10% of global emissions of everything, or 11%, comes from basically a couple regions of the world. About half of the world's deforestation in recent decades came from the Amazon and Indonesia, and primarily for beef and animal feed from the Amazon. So that's meat driving most of that. And then palm oil driving most of it across Indonesia. So we have a handful of issues driving most of the problem. That's either bad news or good news, depending on how you look at the world. Some people look at that and say, oh, that's terrible. Only a few countries and a few big corporations are responsible. I'm like, well, hell, I think that's actually kind of good news in a perverse way.
I do too. Makes it easier to fix the problem.
Yeah, I know where to go. Yeah, we know where to go. those guys over there, it's going to be disproportionately beef. It's going to be disproportionately rice. It's going to be disproportionately overusing fertilizers. We found, for example, in some analyses we did in the past that about, I think it's like 75% of the nitrous oxide emissions from overusing fertilizer comes from three countries: China, India, and the United States, and a handful of commodities: maize, soybeans, and so on. So we can kind of focus, not just by doing a little bit of everything everywhere, but we know where the leverage points are in terms of the actual crops and commodities, in terms of geography, and often supply chains and big corporate and financial entities. But pivoting to your question about, is there a role for technology here, or is it all just policy and behavior? I think it's all the above. We do have a lack of good technologies that could assist these. Policy will follow economics and markets and technology. Policy never leads.
No.
Policymakers are cowards. They don't lead, they follow. The reason we're now seeing political action on climate, I think, is because technology and markets made it something we could actually practically talk about finally, and politicians got on board. So when technologies are available and cheap and work better, like electric cars and heat pumps and solar panels, politicians love that stuff because it's not a sacrifice. They can get on board and say they were leading all along, even if they weren't, because the engineers did their job. I think we need to do the same thing in food. There are things that are just sticky right now that we don't seem to fix, like food waste. Where are the startups tackling food waste? I would like every supply chain to be equipped with sensors, from the field to the refrigerated trucks to the international shipping to my refrigerator. Tell me when food is going bad. Instead of relying on old dates that are stamped on your food that don't mean anything, how about we have technology to help us figure out what food is going bad and what's still good, especially meat and dairy products that are so important. Because 30 to 40% of all the food in the world is thrown away and lost in the system. We need to do better there. That's 30 to 40% of one of the biggest emission sectors wasn't even necessary. So where's the technology for food waste? I think we should see a lot more. How about more technologies to detect methane, or new technologies to watch for deforestation? There are some. Again, Planet Labs is one very good, what went from startup to mature company that I think is changing the world. But I'd love to see more technology investments in spaces that kind of track things, monitor things, help them get better, as well as using AI for logistics, for detecting problems, for rerouting food supply chains to be more transparent, more accountable. And I'm not a fan of all the crypto nonsense, but the idea of maybe using more like blockchain kind of record keeping for more transparency and more truth in supply chain recordings. So we don't have. There are standards out there saying, hey, palm oil should be grown responsibly and not near deforestation, or beef or soybeans. Let's enforce those standards and keep big actors, the big suppliers and big traders in the world accountable. But maybe we need better transparency and record keeping along the way. And this is a huge technology opportunity. Not to mention its benefits for food safety and food prices and food security. This isn't just a climate problem, it's a food problem. And hundreds of millions of people in the world are still hungry. And there's food safety and food health concerns. So I think there's a huge play for tech and food, but it needs to be on the right things. Not vertical farms. Those don't work. They don't help. Not a bunch of fancy high-tech stuff, but things that monitor problems, things that inform us and get us let's bring tech to farming and supply chains in ways that truly elevate the whole thing.
Do you ever get frustrated? You have this team of phenomenal scientists and academics that have laid out this plan so beautifully. And then you have private capital just looking at everything and saying, nope, we pick solar geoengineering.
Well, that does frustrate me because that's just silly. Yeah, I know. We're going to counteract warming that happens mostly in the polar regions, mostly in the wintertime, and mostly at night with stuff that blocks the sun, mostly in the tropics during the day and in the hotter months. Yeah, it's like my feet are on fire, so I'll stick my head in ice water to counteract it. I think solar geoengineering is pretty goofy. Not to mention it does nothing for other problems on the planet. And it's still, anyway, don't get me started. It's just a bad idea. Literally using smoke and mirrors to stop climate change is kind of telling. No, I mean, that could be a research project. I think governments can fund small research, to learn mostly why not to do that, but maybe why some people might want to try it. Sure. But private capital investing in this, that's just bizarre. But again, they're looking to mine a hype cycle. Maybe they get in early and people get excited about it and they exit while the price is high. Did they actually save the world? No. That's a big distraction, I think, sometimes. But I really wish, the more investors, but again, I blame my community. I'm not blaming the investor community. Investors are acting rationally for what they're trying to do most of the time, which is to make money. I get it. But if you actually say, and you look in the mirror and say, no, no, we're an impact fund or a blended impact venture fund, then maybe you should have some actual climate scientists, not engineers pitching you their tech, but actual planetary climate scientists who look at the whole planet and ask, like, hey, how does this affect the future of our climate system? How does this affect the future of our planet's ecosystems? Is this really the right bet? Those conversations never seem to happen. I don't see climate scientists in the room with VCs. I don't see them in the room with private equity or even institutional investment. So there's due diligence at the technological level, but not at the systems level. Like, was this even the right solution to start with? Like carbon capture machines. Any climate scientist will tell you they're idiotic. They don't work. They're not going to be helpful. We need to do other things. This is not a big play. But if you've already decided to look at carbon capture, there'll be lots of engineers who will be happy to tell you the merits of this version of technology versus the other. But you need somebody else in the room to say, yeah, but the atmosphere won't notice this. It's too slow, it's too small, and it's too expensive to ever matter. Don't even bother. So there's two levels of that scientific due diligence. One is kind of the macro systems level. That's what's missing. And then within that, then the narrow technological assessment, that I think is probably being done pretty well. But not at the bigger systems level. Was this even in the right area to be thinking about at all? Or what fraction of your portfolio?
Who are those systems?
Well, seriously, we just started. I'll do a plug, sure, a shameless plug. We just started this month a new thing called the Drawdown Capital Coalition, which is a kind of pro bono science advisory to impact investors and philanthropists. And actually, next week, we're starting a whole bunch of free science briefings on really important topics from those big climate system thinkers who are kind of trying to talk about what are the right things to even be talking about. And then we do the due diligence on the specific narrow technology. But we skipped that first step. We're going to be doing deep dives also with investors, philanthropists, and corporates on things like deforestation, on methane, things that have been kind of neglected for too long, or areas where the hype is way out ahead of the science, like regenerative agriculture. Yeah, we need to fix agriculture, but agriculture as a carbon sink is pretty limited. And yet a lot of people are throwing money at it without really doing the science on this and not investing enough in things like reducing emissions from rice or from fertilizers or from deforestation. So we're trying to kind of clarify and kind of provide that big macro systems lens with people who are really good at this, but also good communicators, but also who don't have a financial stake in the outcome. None of us have a financial conflict or any investments or any patents in these areas. So hopefully that can be a kind of an independent source of big picture truth on like, hey, what are the right areas to even be thinking about before you get to looking at one particular pitch deck from a company?
That's amazing. Where can we find out more about that?
Well, go to drawdown.org and /capital coalition, I think with a hyphen in there, or just look at our website. But that's going to be coming up soon. And there's going to go to the drawdown.org website and look for the Drawdown Capital Coalition. And there's a form to sign up and we can start to include people on a mailing list. Our science briefings are free and open to people who sign up. The deep dives, people have to apply though, because we need like Chatham House rules and things like that, because people will be, we're asking the investors and corporates and philanthropists in the room to share their experiences funding different things with each other. And so if people want to get into that and have a little bit of kind of the peer-to-peer due diligence on kind of, as well as the scientific due diligence, what good areas might be to focus on. That's where we're trying to create a community there. So that could be very interesting. We're really excited to see how it turns out.
I'll drop that link in the show notes. That sounds incredibly helpful. I always like to ask everyone, we just talked through all the different sectors, but I always love to ask everyone where they think the low-hanging fruit is in climate tech. You referenced this, you call it the emergency brakes in your roadmap, but there are lots of technologies within that. What's your favorite?
Well, my favorite solutions right now, and the ones we desperately need to have a shot of getting to climate security in the future, if we have any shot of a Paris-like outcome, like somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees, it's going to be because we hit the emergency brakes really hard in the next 5 years. And those are going to be methane leaks in oil and gas and coal and all the pipelines and fugitive emissions and flaring. So methane in the energy sector is a big one. Methane in agriculture, a little bit harder because it's mainly beef and dairy and a little bit from rice, but we have to tackle that too. Another big emergency brake is stopping deforestation. It's one of the biggest single emitters of greenhouse gases on Earth by far. And by the way, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss and one of the biggest drivers of water problems and air quality problems and health problems and sources of future pandemics and so on and so on and so on. We got to keep our rainforest intact, folks. And climate change is just one reason why. And it's a huge one. So stopping deforestation. And we don't need to deforest. Deforestation is not helping feed the world or improving the lives of poor people. It's just for profit. It's just for greed. We need to stop it. So let's focus on deforestation. There's a great organization now called forestpeopleclimate.org, has a great roadmap for how to tackle deforestation, mainly looking at the philanthropic world and governments, but also I think plays for investors, especially impact investors could be found there too. So that's a great resource and I encourage that. And then efficiency, like half of climate change is stop doing stupid crap. 40% of the world's food never gets eaten. How much of the world's energy is wasted, deliberately or by accident or because of just thermodynamic inefficiency. We can do so much better and be more efficient. And the world's beginning to do that. There is a grand decoupling, finally, of economic growth and emissions. There are 40 countries in the world, roughly, that are doing that. The UK is leading the world in this. The emissions of the United Kingdom are down 40% from their peak. Yeah. Insane. Yet your economy has grown a lot in that time. In the United States, where I live, we peaked our emissions back around 2007, and they've dropped by 20%, even though the U.S. economy has grown enormously since then, as has the U.S. population. So we're beginning to get more efficient per dollar of economic activity, but we got to cut emissions in absolute terms too, which 30 to 40 countries are doing, but we have to accelerate that. So energy efficiency, reducing waste, food waste is a huge one of the biggest overall. And so, methane, deforestation, and efficiency. That's where I would focus most of the attention right now.
All right. One quick final question, because we're talking big picture and because you have dedicated your entire career to climate. We just had a COP in December where 70,000 people flew in to Dubai to attend a conference hosted by a state-owned oil company. Are we losing the plot?
Well, I admire a lot of people who work on the international front and through the UN process. But let me ask you this. If the fate of the world was resting on the United Nations, would you feel very comfortable about that? I mean, literally, if our future is going to be determined by the UN and the US Congress, for example, we're entirely and utterly screwed. So I'm not betting a lot on those processes. And the UN process is designed to fail. It was designed deliberately to fail. All it takes is one country objecting to something and it slows down the works and derails things. And it's hosted by an oil emirate. Come on. It's corrupt. It's designed to fail. And at best, it's just a place for people to kind of pose for photos a lot. So I've worked in climate my whole life. I've never been to a COP. I have a lifelong boycott of going to COPs because I think they're, for my time and energy, not really worth it. I'm glad other people go. It is a place where we need to get things done. I think it helps set the stage of conversations.
It does,
Then the real work gets done, which is in individual countries, mostly smaller units of government, like cities and states are probably the most effective, but some countries. But it also sets the stage for conversations in business and technology and culture. But we have multiple levers to pull to change the world. Policy is one of them. But we have technology and markets, which so far have been leading the way on actual climate solutions. Policy follows way behind that. But we also have culture and deploying capital and other things we need to do. Let's pull on all the levers. I don't think there's just one that will work and save the day. And especially at the big global scale, a UN levered, I doubt we're going to have COP 30 or whatever, 29, 30, 31. There'll be a lot more, I bet, where they suddenly will announce, hey, we solved all the problems. Everybody just agreed. It's all done. Yay, let's go home. That's never going to happen. The real work in climate change has been done mainly by engineers and businesses, I think, and by activists and local policymakers doing things kind of, that are practical, short term, get it done. There's a lot of talk, but we need action, and we're going to find it in lots of interesting places.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Any last minute words?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it. Happy to come back sometime if it makes sense. But yeah, I'd love to leave people with two thoughts really is, hey, we have the solutions we need. If you think we don't have the technologies we need to stop climate change, you're wrong. We have them. Drawdown outlines them very carefully, but some of them would be difficult and some might be expensive. Most of them are not. Most of them are cheaper than the world we have now and better than the world we have now and are ready to go today. So, don't wait for technology. We got pretty much all that we need to get the job mostly done, if not entirely. Sure, technology will help, but now is better than new. Time is more important than tech. So let's deploy what we have, make it cheaper, faster, better. There's definitely a role for the private sector and venture and tech in this. There's money to be made. There's businesses to build. And I think it's the biggest business opportunity in human history. But stop chasing shiny objects. That's not business. That's ego. That's science fiction, not good business sense. Let's go do things that actually give the world goods and services today that we desperately need and do it now. I think that's the biggest play in history.
And that is it for this episode with Dr. Jonathan Foley. If you found it useful, please subscribe and write a positive review because it helps people discover the podcast. Thanks for listening and catch you at the next one. Bye, everyone.